Hi there, I'm Donald Lawrence. I teach in the Visual and Performing Arts Department at TRU in Visual Arts, and I'm chair of the department at the moment. We're in the Kamloops Art Gallery downtown, and I have an exhibition in here at the moment, Casting the Eye Adrift. It's a survey exhibition looking back at my work over the last 37 years or so, so the earliest work's 1987. And it's curated by Charo Neville, the art gallery's curator. And for this gift of learning, what we're going to do is take a number of excerpts from a walk-around tour that Charo and I recently did of the exhibition. And as you're in the space or as you're watching the video, what you'll see are a whole range of different artworks, from photographs to drawings to sculptural forms, these kinds of things. And in various ways, they touch upon and will talk about a number of different ideas. Some of those have to do with memory and thinking back to early childhood experiences and bringing them alive in these artworks. A lot of the artworks, maybe most of them, are about relationships between urban culture and wilderness culture, and a kind of a meeting place in the middle. And likewise, a meeting place in many of the works around different aspects of science and technology. And a particular interest in the camera obscura, and earlier a historical optical advice, as we'll talk about. You'll also find in the exhibition that there's a kind of a range of interests, from things that are quite well crafted, whether that means, for example, like the rendering of tone and perspective and things like that in a drawing, to other sculptural-based activities that are quite experimental, including this artwork that's behind us. And I'd ask anyone in the exhibition or watching this to think about that very broad range in art making and my practice between techniques and materials that are known, and using materials in an experimental way, or maybe, as per a lot of art making over the past 100 years or so, bringing things into the art gallery and into art making that wouldn't normally be thought of as art, but that come into this kind of hybrid realm. We actually have a camera obscura that you can enter into as well, and that's across the road at the Paramount Theatre. It's available for tours throughout the time from now until roughly the end of September. And that's in partnership with the Kamloops Film Society, and it's actually sits on the canopy above the street level of the Paramount Theatre. And so I hope that you'll enjoy this. So these excerpts from the walk around with Charo are basically what I'm presenting as a gift of learning to whoever's tuning in. And otherwise, thanks of course to both TRU and the Kamloops Art Gallery, as well as the Kamloops Film Society.
Hello, I'm Charo Neville, and I'm the curator of the Kamloops Art Gallery, and Donald Lawrence and I are standing in the central gallery in his exhibition Casting the Eye Adrift. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how the exhibition's organized and give an introduction to the two thematic sections in the exhibition, and then Donald will go through each work. So it's a retrospective exhibition which covers almost 4 decades of Donald's practice. There's a lot of work, probably the earliest is 1987. And so we've divided it, organized it not chronologically, but into these two thematic sections. The first looking at what we might call early works. It's 1990s to mid-2000s. And so some of the themes that come up in these bodies of work really carry throughout Donald's practice, and then we'll carry into the second section, which focuses more on his recent work with cameras obscura. One thing to mention too is that a lot of the way that we've displayed the work, it ties into Donald's interest in museum display and the conventions of display themselves. And so we've included, for example, all of the cameras for making the photographs in this project, drawings, journals, a lot of material in vitrines or cases that are as much a part of the work as, say, the big sculptural works. So hopefully these themes will come out as Donald takes us through each work. So we'll start in 2000, I think. This is the date for this project.
Yeah, it's a body of work called the Underwater Pinhole Photography Project. Many people will be familiar with the idea of a pinhole camera, often constructed from something as simple as a cardboard box, where light comes in through a very small pinhole-sized opening and forms an image inside exposed onto photographic paper or film. This project takes that very simple idea of the pinhole camera and complicates it, asking, can a pinhole camera be made to work underwater? And so that's what we see here, and this is about the second or third version of them. They take 4" by 5" black and white film, which goes in a hatch in the side, gets made watertight, and then it's lowered into the water with ropes and pulleys and things like that, and operated mechanically, kind of remotely, that way through very simple mechanics. And then it's pulled up to the surface, and chemical fluids are either poured into the top part so that the camera becomes its own portable darkroom as well, or the films can be taken out and processed in a kind of a portable kit that I have. And so the resultant photographs are mostly these kind of black and white ones that you see here. And the one with the starfish is actually the first of these that I managed to create with these cameras, and I was really happy that it worked so well. The over-elaborated form, that's also a part of my aesthetic, if you like, and the cameras are like that. Everything on the camera does something, but it's also a very complex, almost cumbersome kind of object at the same time. So kind of an idea of practicality and excess kind of tied into one structure.
Yeah, and people will see that I've used wilderness in quotes throughout, so maybe you want to elaborate a bit on that, and being a social construction and about our relationship with nature.
Sure, I think many artists and writers and scholars are interested in asking questions about what terms like landscape and wilderness mean, and since I've been making work in the late 1980s, early 1990s, those have been kind of prevalent interests for me, and as we'll see throughout the exhibition, many of the artworks are kind of linked to that idea. And so wilderness is complicated by these works. It's not simply something that's out there remote from urban society and that's pristine. It's something that's always in dialogue with urban society. And the very idea of wilderness is, of course, a cultural idea. And you see the roots of that in early literature, and you see it carry on into, through the centuries, into contemporary Western consumer society, which many of these works kind of intersect and are about somehow. And notions of a kind of romantic individual and whatnot. And we'll see that more prevalent in some of the works, but they're definitely at play here. This project was about, for me, was about remembering this place that I'd seen when we first moved to Victoria, and that seemed kind of far off, but really it was just kind of like half a mile offshore, a mile offshore. And so when I was older and when I was into kayaking, I thought I'm going to go back to Fiddle Reef, and I went back and found that the lighthouse was actually gone. And so that interested me for a couple of reasons. One, wanting to go back to this place that was, sort of important to me, but also that for a period of time I hadn't noticed that the lighthouse was gone. So I realized that the importance of memories and things that are important to you kind of shift over time. So my approach to making this was to first spend a couple of weeks or so, something like that, going out to the island, out to Fiddle Reef, and very carefully measuring it. And you'll see in some of these journals and drawings these exceedingly detailed measurements. And then from those, converting them into these kind of large-scale map-like drawings of the reef that represented the reef at low tide, mid tide, which is about what the model shows, and then high tide, where really all you see is the base of the lighthouse and a few rocks. And what I was doing for that was measuring with literally measuring, taking a lot of compass bearings, and also figuring out a way by a combination of keeping track of where the horizon was and using the height of a kayak paddle to figure out the vertical elevation. So what I found myself doing was kind of inventing my own surveying method, but knowing that what I was really doing was invoking kind of basic surveying principles. So it's one of these kinds of things that runs across sort of like a professional activity of surveying, but figuring it out on my own terms in a kind of a DIY sort of amateur way, and that kind of interests me. From first the studies and then the scale maps, I then created this model of the reef. And it's made as a kind of a bricolage of these different materials. Like the rocks are formed from rubber raincoats and rain boots and things like that. And the underlying part from these sort of mostly domestic things like a chair and an ironing board. And then this toy boat here. And they're all things that I got in thrift shops or garage sales around Victoria while I was making this. So the project was also partly about gathering these materials and then making the structure in this kind of unconventional collage sort of way, responding to the materials and what I could find as much as the accuracy of this place. And so it's kind of on the one hand quite rough looking, but it's on the other hand quite to scale. So it's kind of got a kind of a balance to it that way.
I think one thing to point out here too is that visitors will notice a lot of models throughout the exhibition. So this model is the work, where a lot of your other model making is preparatory for a larger work.
That's right. Yeah, I think there's three types actually. That characterizes this one perfectly. The artwork wouldn't exist without a model because they're one and the same. Several of them are preparatory. Others, a couple of them came afterwards too, and that's a way to almost like explain a work that might not exist any longer, that's very complex and fits in with another whole science side of thing of the demonstration apparatus and a model being created to demonstrate something.
So we're standing now in one of the largest works in the exhibition. You can tell its scale by our scale in front of it, a massive undertaking. It's titled Torham Van Fairyland, about 2003 to 2005. And it's a really good example of the way that you worked at a site and did a lot of surveying and a lot of preparatory photographs and drawings in advance of what we see here. And all of that material is also included in the exhibition. And so then in 2005 it was shown at the Contemporary Art Gallery in Vancouver.
The Torham van is a ship that was built in the early 20th century. The name coming from Toronto, Hamilton, and Vancouver, kind of a derivation of the three that was its root. And it was wrecked at the town of Fairyland on the east coast of Newfoundland in 1926. And so that's what this represents. So this represents a Scotch boiler, the term for one of the steam boilers that one of two that would have been built into this ship. And it's an actual size construction in the front here. For the exhibition in the Contemporary Art Gallery, there are actually two of these, as there are at the shipwreck site. The second one was about half the size of this one, and they had a kind of a three-dimensional diminishing perspective in the Contemporary Art Gallery. Here we're featuring just the one, the main one, and nice and kind of well lit here. I have a few interests here, an interest in older technology, especially maritime technology, and the way that something is derelict and lost and overlooked. It's very much just kind of abandoned at the site, and paying a lot of attention to that, going and spending a week surveying it and measuring it, much like the FIDDLE REEF project that way. As we experience here installing it, it's a lot of complexity to piece it all together each time. Okay, so the idea of the installation in the Contemporary Art Gallery of this three-dimensional spatially compressed illusion is an interest that's recurring in my work and that I've had from some works I did during my BFA studies where I was looking at illusion in Dutch art of the 16th, 17th, 18th century, and then in Baroque art. And a couple of artworks in Rome, one by Borromini and Andrea Pozzo, use these principles of spatially compressed forms. And so I've for a long time incorporated these ideas of illusion into art making, of which this is the largest and most kind of grandiose example.
So now we're standing in front of a work called the SLED from 1995, and it's actually on loan to us from the Vancouver Art Gallery's collection, and includes some photographs that are in the Kamloops Art Gallery's collection. So this work and a coinciding work from 1993, Romantic Commodities, really tease out the ideas that Donald was talking about around art and wilderness, in quotes, and urban and wilderness cultures. So this is a good place to start with our mini RV in front of us here.
It interests me as a kind of an example of a commodified experience of the wilderness and of that whole romantic notion of the lone figure surviving out in the wild. And it's one that I partake in at times during solo kayaking trips and things like that, but that I'm also critical of for the way that it's kind of wrapped up in consumer society. And this would be a product from the 1980s and 1990s, but it has a much longer tradition than that you can trace back through exploration journals and things like that. So it's, many of these works are about something that I very much like and I'm part of, and at the same time, hopefully have a kind of a critical perspective on. So what you see here in the construction is it's kind of like the way I referred to the floating kayak darkroom earlier. It's a very fanciful vehicle, so something that's kind of a folly, fits within an architectural realm that way, more so than has the most efficient, most practical kind of outdoor wildernessy quality to it. So what it represents is these kind of rock forms constructed and painted in a very kind of overtly romantic way, resembling the ones on the tin can. And then in lieu of the fire that's represented on the tin can, these kind of things that we have in urban society, but they're wilderness versions of them. So a whisper light, a stove with an outback oven on it, and a Coleman lantern, and a Coleman heater. And so as Charo mentioned, it's kind of like an RV. I think of it as like a low-tech a loner's RV, kind of like a cross between an RV and a caravel, a type of ship of the 16th century, all kind of laden down and loaded with its stuff. And then taken out into the wilderness and assembled into a shelter that mimics this one on the storm kit. And in this case, the journal plays off my interest in journals for actual trips and whatnot, but in this case is a kind of a fictional construct of a travel with the sled, and it ruminates on the provisions that we have in here, and how things that might be taken for granted in a city become luxuries out in the wilderness, and that kind of idea. Okay, so we'll go in a little bit of reverse chronology here, but not too much. The SLED was from 1995, and this work was from 1992, 1993, belonging to Romantic Commodities, the body of work that preceded and led to the SLED. And so as you can see, this particular work, Storm Kit, is an oversized, kind of exaggerated version of the small tin can storm kits, and with basically a replication of the front figure and a couple of 18th century Romantic poems on the back. And so I was interested in the early 1990s when I was making this, in this phenomenon that I was starting to see of bottled water. Up to that time, Canada had been regarded as a place of abundant water resources, and all of a sudden it was something commodified, something to be preciously protected and marketed. And so the stockpile here stands in for a stockpile of almost anything that society might need, but was something prescient at the time maybe. And I particularly like this brand of it, Selkirk Springs, partly for the reference maybe to the Selkirk Mountains, but most specifically to the little gold figure on it, which if the figure here on the can represents the romantic lone individual, the gold figure is the Vitruvian man, a Roman ideal which was taken up by artists such as Leonardo da Vinci in the Renaissance to determine what the ideal man would be like. And so a very historical urban notion that precedes this later romantic notion.
Maybe you can talk a bit of about how that man appears through your own persona and
Sure.
in the frontiersman that we see in the video in the SLED, and connecting your own kind of personal experience through the outdoors, but in this form of this persona in your work.
Sure, and I think it comes from a combination of, well, many things probably, but say two things. I definitely come from a background of being interested in the outdoors and going camping and things like that, and that clearly traces back to 19th century, 18th century pursuits. And for me, going kayaking and things like that, including solo wilderness trips, I feel that I have a kind of a knowledge of the wilderness, and particularly certain environments. Yet, from being an artist and from looking at cultural forms and asking questions about them, notions of rugged individuality and whatnot, they're problematic, right? So you can look at the way that any of those notions, whether we see them in literature, film, or older or contemporary art, they represent a kind of a bringing of urban ideas of those rural and wilderness cultures into society, and almost kind of like capturing that wilderness experience. And so it's kind of I think in most of these works is kind of a celebration and a critique of something at the same time.
So we are standing in front of the Drumheller ALBERTASAURus, an actual dinosaur bone that has been a family artifact in Donald Lawrence's family since you were a child, and traveled with you across the country, and really is kind of at the heart of your early interests, certainly sculptural and in terms of the museum display that you've been talking about, but also thinking about objects in relation to your art practice.
So I looked at this dinosaur bone as being this thing that's flowed not just through my artwork in a way, but through the family as a whole, as a precursor to many of my works. Very latent, kind of not overt, but kind of perhaps below the surface, so to speak. The other case that's here has a number of other family artifacts, and they represent, they show the way that the bone has been understood not just in the context of my work in this exhibition, but by the family as a whole.
So now we're in the second section of the exhibition, which focuses on themes relating to Donald's interest in the convergence of art and science and technology, specifically through his camera's OBSCURA works. And so some of the main themes that will come out as Donald talks about each of these projects are around site specificity. So each of these camera OBSCURA projects was made for a specific site, and there's a lot of research and interest in the history of each site that goes into that. And then also the sculptural approaches that we saw in the earlier works are still held true in the way that he constructs these sculptures, and of course the use of the model as well.
Sure, and so this is a model created in 2016 representing an artwork which is behind us here, created in 2015. So it's a model of a camera OBSCURA. And the term camera OBSCURA comes from about 1604, 1606, something like that, from Johannes Kepler. And it's a Latin phrase that simply means dark room. So camera is room and OBSCURA is dark. And so the idea of a camera OBSCURA at the time was that it would be a darkened space that light would enter into through either an open aperture, a small hole, or through a lens, and lens technology was emerging at the time. And an image of whatever is outside, so in this case Charo, would be cast inside onto a screen or perhaps onto a table, upside down and backwards. And so this was maybe not quite a merging of art and science at the time, because they weren't really separate. It was It was an indistinguishable realm between art and science and perhaps entertainment. And later they diverged. And so people like Johannes Kepler were polymaths. They had all these different interests in astronomy, optics, physiology, how the human eye works. And so it was through the creation of these structures that solar phenomena were studied, and that understandings of how human vision worked were studied or proven. And those studies go way back. Ibn al-Hathan, an Islamic scholar, used many camera obscura devices to study these same principles, and drawing upon ancient Greek and perhaps Chinese theory to do so. So there's a long history to this. Except for the childhood works that are in the educational space and whatnot, this is the earliest work in the exhibition. It's from 1987, and it represents the first camera obscura that I made. I was an MFA student at York University at the time, and those of us in the program decided to create a temporary 2-week-long exhibition of outdoor art. And I'd read about these public walk-in camera obscuras that were in Europe in the 19th century and whatnot. I hadn't yet seen one, but I thought I'll create one. So I created this tent-like structure that you would enter into, and the model represents the first of 2 versions of it. In this case, the idea that a participant would sit in a chair inside the structure and be turned around by people outside. And I like that idea. I may even build it someday, but it wasn't approved for safety reasons. So I kind of hastily, I had a night to redesign it. So I came up with this other idea of a lightweight structure suspended within a kind of a skeletal outer supporting structure. And people would enter into this, and then it turned very easily. So it was suspended off the middle and turn. And so as you entered into it, you'd find it would move, and you'd walk it in a circle. And so it gave this kind of panoramic view of the York campus. And we produced this kind of DIY catalog using typewriters and photocopiers as technology at the time to produce this catalog, including with photographs taken the day the exhibition opened in the catalog. So we kind of figured out how to do this as a group. This one here, One Eye Folly, it was created in 2008 for an exhibition called Ice Follies at North Bay, Ontario, by the WKP Kennedy Gallery. It's actually biannual. They invite artists every couple of years. And what they ask the artists to do is to create an artwork that somehow is a takeoff on the idea of an ice fishing hut. And then all of these works are exhibited on, in some cases created on, frozen Lake Nipissing. And then people come out and view the works once the exhibition's open. And so One Eye Folly, for me, was a return to the interest in the camera obscura. It'd been quite a long time since I'd created one. And the pinhole cameras, they were kind of like a like-minded interest between that time. But here I decided for Ice Follies to create a camera obscura as an ice fishing hut, or vice versa. It's got this structure built on top of the hull of a rowboat. The rowboat was given to me by a friend, Andrew Wong. He'd built it. And then it's got this kind of wood frame construction clad in these kind of 19th century tin ceiling tiles with an open aperture at the front, and then these hatches that close up to make a light-proof structure. And then you'll see from the inside that I think of it kind of almost like a cave-like space inside. It has these little niches for matches and a candle and a lantern and things like that. Again, harkening back perhaps to the way I created the SLED. And then the whole thing imagined as this boat that once the ice melts, that the boat will be floating there. And again, it's kind of, it functions as a camera obscura, and it functioned very nicely, but is otherwise, again, a kind of a fanciful construction. And so from that, and you see it documented here in photographs and a preliminary drawing for it. And from that work, then I became interested in that idea of being inside a boat that's a camera obscura. And so that led to the next work that we'll see here. Okay, so making the One Eye Folly prompted me to want to create another work that that would be a camera obscura as a boat or vice versa. And so I took a KLEPPER kayak, a German kayak constructed in the 1960s. It's a folding kayak, so it has a skeleton and then this rubberized skin that goes over it. And it's one that's important to me, again, as a kind of an artifact. I'd used it for trips twice to the Outer Hebrides in Scotland, and the trip along the eastern coast of Maine was with this kayak. And so I think of it now as having kind of retired into an art career, and it's become this floating camera obscura called Kepler's KLEPPER. So it puts together the idea of the KLEPPER kayak and Johannes Kepler and the invention of the camera obscura. So the video here shows the camera obscura being used on the Tamar River in Tasmania. So this whole work was created in 2011 during an artist residency there, and filmed in different places along the Tamar River to represent this kind of journey with it. And you'll see me kind of navigating the kayak by way of this very small and inverted image. And so it became a curious process of having to kinetically learn how to navigate the boat based on this inverted image. And that interested me as a problem, and also how easy it would be to become accustomed to doing that. The filming itself was done mostly by towing a video camera on a small raft behind the kayak, and then for a few scenes anchoring it and then paddling towards it.
So with the Kepler's KLEPPER, we see you having the individual experience in the kayak. And the works behind us, VIDI and the Coastal Camera Obscura, and then the Nanton project, are all cameras obscura that you invite the public to come in and experience. So that's been not necessarily a new thing, but something that you've really been investigating more, I would say, in your work recently, is that participatory experience. Certainly, like, the experience is uncanny, and so entering this darkened space and seeing it for yourself, that inverted view, is really important to kind of transformative experiences for the viewer.
Sure, and as you mentioned earlier, there's an interest in many of my works to respond into a specific site. Mm-hmm. So I think each of these works does that. It takes that interest in wanting to put the viewer, the participant, inside that optical experience of the camera obscura, and to do so in relation to some particular location. So this work, it's kind of two separate works and one work at the same time. It came from that the Kepler's KLEPPER, as you said, the individual experience, kind of like the SLED that way, to wanting to share that with a wider audience. So it was created for Art Marathon, a 48-hour arts festival run by Eastern Edge Gallery in Newfoundland that goes all day and all night. And so this was one work for that. And so it sat in Quidi Harbor, a small historic harbor, just a couple of miles from the main harbor of St. John's, Newfoundland. And so it was imagined as this floating structure that you would enter into by kayak. And then once you were inside it, then you would see a projected image of the Quidi landscape surrounding it. And then this is kind of like an overhead view, of sort of like a plan view of it. That work was reimagined, pieces of it kept, like the tent covering kept, and then reconstructed as a project with other sites in Vancouver, in False Creek in 2017, as what I'm now calling the Coastal Camera Obscura. And so it's now basically a kit that can be reassembled at different locations. And so here it's seen in False Creek, where it sat for about a week. And we used Habitat Island as a kind of a base for it, and the beach there as a staging ground for running kayak tours out to it. And the recreational boating community of False Creek, which is kind of interesting in the context of the Romantic Commodities work, and that kind of wilderness within the city feel, or vice versa. other participants would come by with their own boats, with canoes and with paddle boards and things like that. So we just welcomed whoever could fit inside it. Then that was closely paralleled in time to the Midnight Sun Camera Obscura project up in Dawson City, Yukon, which myself and a number of people organized. There were about 13 visual artists creating these off-site projects around the city, including the one that's represented here that where I put a camera obscura onto the side of the George Black Ferry that crosses the Yukon River. And we had numerous scholars involved in that with interest in the history of cameras obscura. And so we had this kind of hybrid arts festival, academic symposia, involving lots of artists, very community engaged, numerous TRU and one NASCAD student involved in it and having an exhibition of their own work as a part of it. So quite a kind of a multivariate event. And also with a couple of other TRU faculty, Leah Bucknell and Ernie Kroger involved, along with many TRU students. And then that exhibition, following from the Midnight Sun Camera Obscura project, there was an exhibition here at the Kamloops Art Gallery in 2016 representing what happened in Dawson City here, and then a traveling exhibition emerging out of the University of Lethbridge. And then maybe that brings us to the last project here. Took a grain bin from the 1920s, something that's not much use to the farmers in the area. It's a tiny, diminutive grain bin in comparison to the modern large industrial ones. So they said, sure, you can have that. And so I converted it into a camera obscura by building a large circular table inside with the help of a couple of research assistants, Levi Glass and Garnet Dirksen. And Ryland Forty helped me with some measuring and surveying of the site first. And then with Jim McCarthy and welding at TRU, so this is the whole TRU experience, creating this top for this welded structure at the top that's the optical mechanism for it that rotates around. And it does so by way of this gearing system that I designed, and that carries the gearing down inside the structure. And there you can kind of turn it around with a wheel. And so it rotates the structure on the top, creating this sort of panoramic moving image on the table. And the last part here has a case that shows some of the careful planning drawings for this, which were necessary for the approval of it as a project. And one more of the journals. And that's a journal not of a camera obscura, but a study of another 18th century construction in Friesland in northern Netherlands, the Eisinga Planetarium, named for and by Ise Eisinga, who turned his whole house, his whole place of business also into a walk-in planetarium with the motions of the planets and the sun being driven by this very complex gearing system, likely inspired by windmills in the area. And so I drew upon the technology of that I'd observed through these studies to carry a bit of that into this structure here.
So the final work to mention will soon be installed on the Paramount Theatre. The inherent nature of cameras obscura is that they need daylight to appear, and so that's a project that you've been working on that we'll be able to install soon and give tours of, and so maybe we can end on about that work.
Sure. So with thanks to the Kamloops Film Society and Paramount Theatre, it'll be right across the road and open for kind of weekly tours. We'll figure out a schedule for those. And it'll invite participants basically to enter into the theater and go up the steps into the area roughly around where the projection room is, and then walk out onto the canopy. But rather than just going right onto the canopy, people will turn and go into this tent-like structure, which is basically a kind of a 1960s, 1970s perhaps, pioneer family tent that I've kind of reconfigured and reshaped, that will have a set of 3 seats inside it to view a camera obscura projection looking back down Victoria Street.
And so our hope is that people can actually have the experience,
Yeah.
because that's so important to these.
Yeah, as a way of giving an enhanced understanding of what these works here are about. So.